For today's shoot, I've got my hands on the new Canon EOS R5 Mark II and the RF 35mm 1.4. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and I am a zoom lens girl. In fact, my go-to lens is the Canon RF 24-105 2.8. I love this lens because of its versatility, but sometimes there is a time and a place for primes. However, my go-to primes are usually the RF 50mm 1.2 and the RF 85mm 1.2. So where does this 35mm fit? Now in the past, before mirrorless cameras, I had the EF 35mm, but I'm excited to try this brand new RF. All right, so let's talk about when do I reach for this sort of lens? Okay, so first of all, when I go on location and I need to shoot at a wider focal length, but simplify my background, I have a narrower depth of field, this is definitely going to be a good choice. Because with my 24-105, even when I'm shooting at a wide aperture, I'm shooting at 2.8. If I'm at a wide focal length, sometimes the background is just not soft enough. It's still a little bit distracting. So being able to go from 2.8 to 1.4 does make a difference. I decided that I wanted to shoot basically just out front of my studio, and there are a lot of distractions. Everything from cars to garbage to people to ugly brick walls. Thankfully, I shot at 1.4 the entire time using my camera's subject and eye tracking, which means that even if I couldn't quite tell if it was in focus, I knew that my camera had my back. Now, the next reason that I might grab a 35 is when I'm shooting on location and I purposely want to make my subject look taller or maybe play around with distortion a little bit. By getting down low and close to the subject, whatever's closest to the camera looks largest. So this is going to make a dress look fuller, or that low angle will make them look really tall. I use this in my fashion photography all the time. Now, speaking of distortion, I have found that in beauty photography, it is a huge trend right now to distort beauty images just a little bit. And you might have noticed this. If I am going to a makeup store, I will see a lot of campaigns that are close up, but they look like they're shot a little bit too wide of a focal length. There's a little bit of weird distortion, but it is super in and super trendy. And that's something that I would like to give a try because it's not something that I use too much in my photography. Now, one of the reasons I chose my subject is I love her eyes. They're wide set, they're big and beautiful. So when I got close up for beauty shots, shooting at 35mm, it really exaggerated and drew even more attention to her beautiful eyes. Now, this is the very first time I have held this lens at all. And so there's a couple things I'm noticing about it. First of all, I love that it is pretty small and lightweight. If I'm going to add a lens that's not one of my go-tos to my kit, I don't want it to be large and heavy. So this is super convenient. But the other thing that I love is built into the lens itself, it has this aperture ring, which means I can actually dial in my aperture here. Now, the RF lenses do have a variable dial that you could assign aperture to or ISO, a variety of things. But having this dedicated aperture dial is fantastic because I can go from 1.4 to f16 in a snap. It's so fast, but it's also pretty firm, so I'm not going to bump it and it's not going to accidentally change my aperture, which I love. Especially if I'm playing around with exposure simulation, I can just quickly dial the aperture to exactly where I want it to be. I love this idea. Because I am so used to shooting with zoom lenses, it's a bit of a challenge to switch over to primes. I'm used to just changing my focal length to get the perfect composition. So using the 35, I started moving around the scene to find the perfect frame, the perfect composition. So at times I would get down low and frame her against the trees, or I'd move around and frame her with a railing. Now, my first instinct to try to get rid of some of the distractions was to shoot wide open and then also to underexpose the background and add a strobe. But I found once I was shooting at 1.4, I actually loved that high key look and a strobe wasn't even necessary. When I framed her against the trees, it created this beautiful bokeh, this beautiful blur and texture to the background that I thought was really, really pleasing, and it simplified the scene. At other times, when I moved around, the overexposed background became pure white, which usually you're trying to avoid, but in this case, it was another way to make my background look even more clean and high fashion. As I moved around the scene, some of the things I was looking for was the ability to create depth, have a foreground, middle ground, and background. When you're shooting at 35mm, if you shoot flat onto a subject, it can get really stale, it can look really flat. So what I did is I'd put things in the foreground, like a fence, or the subject's hand, or even some foliage, in order to create that fall off of focus and make the shot even more interesting. After shooting outdoors, we decided to photograph by window light, But rather than a window, what we did is open up my garage door. This creates a big, huge, soft, indirect light source, which is completely glowing on her skin. We set up 2 seamless paper backgrounds, a Savage Universal Coral and Tulip. This would give me a couple different hues and tonalities to play around with. At times, I would face my subject straight on to get really flat light, and other times I'd come around to the side so I could create more dramatic and sculpting light on my subject, again, playing around with the different backgrounds. Whether I was shooting a mid-length shot or a close-up, I used my 35. So there you have it, my first shoot with the Canon EOS R5 Mark II paired with the RF 35mm 1.4. As you look at these images, even though I was at a fixed focal length, you can see that I got a lot of variation from full length, mid length, and even close-up shots. Some shots looked very even, normal focal length, but others I played around a little bit with distortion. So if you want to see the gear used to make these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below, and of course, visit Adorama.com. And if you've enjoyed these videos and you'd like to see more of me playing around with creative gear, creative lighting, and more, be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.